Australia has revamped its foreign aid program for the first time in more than a decade. Climate, gender equality and local jobs creation top the new agenda in a move aimed at appealing to its Indo-Pacific neighbours amid China's growing influence in the region. Now, from next year, half of all new Australian aid investments worth more than $3 million will include a climate change objective. And all new international projects over the same threshold must have a gender equality target. There'll also be emphasis on creating local jobs to drive the developing economies, among other key commitments. The policy has pointed to economic challenges in the Indo-Pacific. These include a doubling of public debt, a fifth of which was owed to China as of last year. The plan also addresses other concerns in the Pacific Islands. These nations earlier called climate change their greatest security threat. For a closer look at this, joining us live is Alan Bem, Director for the International and Security Affairs Program at the Australia Institute. Now, Alan, Australia in recent times has already sharpened its military and security trajectory, and now it looks like it's moving to consolidate its soft power influence. What strikes you most in this policy update? What stands out in particular?
Yuen, I think what this particular policy announcement is really about is clarifying the basis on which Australia will conduct its development assistance program over the coming years. I think that the policy is designed not to concentrate on the geostrategic issues. It's not a defence document. I think it's very much designed to concentrate on what Australia is seeking to achieve in the Indo-Pacific and what the countries of the Indo-Pacific, and here particularly the Pacific countries, are seeking to derive from Australia's development assistance program. The focus is on the region.
There were a lot of choice words used and phrases, for example, challenging strategic circumstances and ensuring that loans don't create unsustainable debt burdens. What should we read into this, with Beijing and China, of course, in the back of our minds?
Well, look, global debt burdens are global. It's not just a phenomenon in the Pacific or in Asia. I think the Australian government is very sensitive to the fact that a number of the Pacific governments in particular are heading towards very, very high debt burdens. Not just to China. Half of their debts are to the World Bank and to the ADB, and other debts are to countries such as Japan and Australia. China has got quite high debt levels, that's true, but it isn't the predominant issue. I think that for Australian policy, what we're seeking to do is to work with regional countries so that they can manage their affairs, fight against corruption, have much higher standards of financial governance, and generally much more equity in the way in which their national economies work. And that's the reason for the focus on women and the focus on climate.
Let's pick up on climate, which is a big focus, especially for Pacific Islands. The Australian government wants to use what it calls blended finance tools to try to encourage more private sector investment. How do you see this going about? Well,
it's difficult, as I'm sure all of your listeners know, to generate high levels of private sector investment in countries where risk margins are high. The interesting word that's used in this document constantly is catalyse. What the government is seeking to do is to catalyse private investment in the Pacific in particular, which generally means that you want to be able to attract private investment, but ensure that the private investment is not at risk and that it is in fact going to return a rate on the investments that are made. This is difficult, and it will be very interesting, I think, to see how Australia, working with the governments of the Pacific, is able to generate private investment in the first instance and then provide sufficient confidence to private investors that they're going to get a return on their capital. That will be difficult, not impossible, but it will require a lot of work.
Alan, why is driving the climate agenda important to Canberra within the regional context? And is there a bit of a double standard here because not much was said about Australia's own coal and gas policies?
That's a very, very acute question, Yuan, and one to which a lot of people in Australia are very sensitive. And the fact that so little is said in this document about that matter suggests to me that the Australian government is also very sensitive to the tension that exists between Australia as a major carbon energy exporter, both coal and gas, and at the same time a major contributor per capita to global emissions, and at the same time again a country that does want to assist its Pacific neighbours in climate mitigation. These things are very difficult to manage together. And I think that for Australia, there will have to be additional changes in our domestic carbon policies to ensure that we begin in Australia moving towards a reduced carbon footprint so that we are much less of a contributor to the rising levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and most particularly its consequences in the Pacific. As you say, very, very tricky policy issue to deal with, and I'm certain that Pacific countries are going to keep Australia very, very much with its face to the fire on this particular policy issue.
And Alan, apart from climate change, the policy also emphasises gender equality, disability equality as core issues. How do you see this realistically panning out with the countries it says it wants to support? Could you give us some examples?
Look, this has been a main theme of Foreign Minister Penny Wong for at least a decade now. She has put an enormous amount of effort into this matter of gender equity. And it's not just gender equity for the sake of gender equity. It is not a kind of pseudo-Western self-indulgence where we're seeking to make everybody equal. It's got a much more focused reason than that, and it is that the more you increase the participation of women in national economies, the faster those economies grow and the stronger those economies become. So this is really a major tool that Australia would like to assist regional countries to use in expanding their own economies through women's participation in the economy. So the focus on that will be education and health. The best way to generate female participation in the economy is to make sure that women are at least as educated as men, and very frequently they become more educated than men, but that they're also able to manage all of the complicated health issues that do bedevil many of the Pacific countries. So a focus on children's health and women's health is also an important part of what is essentially an economic instrument.
And Alan, one last quick question. Australia, of course, pitching all of this in the best interests of the Indo-Pacific. It says it wants to remain the partner of choice in the region. How can it do this while at the same time balancing domestic demands and getting people at home to buy into its long-term vision?
Again, this is a case where political leadership domestically becomes very important in Australia. There is always resistance in first world countries to providing much in the way of development assistance to its poorer neighbours. It's a well-known phenomenon, and Australia doesn't escape that. But Australia has very particular obligations to the Indo-Pacific, which are driven essentially by our long-term historical links with the Pacific and with Asia, and also our strategic interests in combination with the countries of the Pacific. It's an easy thing for people to talk about increased defence spending in Australia to shore up our strategic position, but it's also the fact that the more you invest in development assistance, the more you invest in an effective multilateral diplomacy, building relationships, building the preconditions for prosperity and the preconditions for regional stability, the more secure you become. So Australia's self-interest is deeply engaged in an enhanced and more disciplined approach to development assistance in Asia and the Pacific. I think that is what the government is attempting to do in the release of this new policy document.
Alan, thank you as always for your insights. That was Alan Bem, Director for the International and Security Affairs Program at the Australia Institute.